actually keep your toes warmer, or do they cut off circulation?
I don't think they keep them warmer. Yeah, I think I was like, my dad used to say, no sense, no feeling. I didn't have any feeling in my toes back then. It was the fashion.
When my girls were growing up.
We're live.
Yeah.
We're live.
Well, they're still doing that.
I know, and I always used to, their friends or anybody that come over and like your socks don't matter.
Yeah, and they're like,
Good evening, everyone. Good evening if you're watching us online. We'll start by singing number 120. 120. Sing 1, 2, and 4. The solid rock. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When darkness veils His lovely face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When He shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in Him be found, dressed in His righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. I might turn to 336. There's a great day coming. 336. After this, Jeff, will you lead us to a word of prayer? There's a great day coming, a great day coming. There's a great day coming by and by, when the saints and the sinners shall be parted right and left. Are you ready for that day to come? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? There's a bright day coming, a bright day coming. There's a bright day coming by and by, but its brightness shall only come to them that love the Lord. Are you ready for that day to come? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? There's a sad day coming, a sad day coming. There's a sad day coming by and by, when the sinner shall hear his doom depart. I know ye not. Are you ready for that day to come? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day? Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment day?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day to gather together to study your word and learn lessons from those that have gone before us. We ask that you be with those that cannot be with us tonight for traveling or sickness. Watch over them, keep them safe, bring them home safely. We ask that you give strength and knowledge to the teacher tonight so that he can give us a lesson that we can use when we leave this place and apply it to our daily lives. We ask all this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
If you're streaming online tonight and we drop, there's nothing I can do about it. Our two tech guys are gone tonight, so I started everything, but if it drops in the middle of this, I'm going to keep on teaching. So that's the best we can do this evening. All right, so we're going to get into this new era of Jewish history. We're leaving the era of the United Kingdom. Solomon's the final ruler, and we're heading into the era of a divided kingdom. And we talked about that period last week. We took kind of a 10,000-foot view of that era. And this next era of Jewish history is characterized by two kingdoms that end in two captivities. So as you begin reading in 1 Kings chapter 12, whenever you see the name Israel, that's referring to the northern kingdom, which was comprised of 10 of the 12 tribes. And when you read the name Judah, that's the southern kingdom that was made up of primarily Judah, but also a little bit of Benjamin as well. And as we're going to see later on in this evening's lesson, we have refugees from the northern 10 tribes that end up migrating down south into Judah and staying there. So the southern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel, both of these kingdoms end up in captivity. The northern kingdom falls in 722 to the Assyrians. The southern kingdom falls over about a 20-year period to the Babylonians. All right, so two kingdoms that end in two captivities. And as we noted last week, the northern kingdom of Israel is ruled by a series of unrighteous kings. There's not a single good king or queen among all the rulers of the northern kingdom of Israel. They are all unrighteous. That's a little bit different, though, down in Judah, where we have a few good kings, but mostly they are unrighteous kings in Judah as well. And as I mentioned a moment ago, both kingdoms end up being conquered. So just to kind of give us a little bit of a sense, maybe visually, about the time we're looking at. So we're looking at this 430-year time period between the time that Solomon built the temple, the first temple, to the time that Joshua and Zerubbabel build the second temple. So this period of about 430 years where you've got two kingdoms, Israel to the north, Judah to the south, two captivities, the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity, and then this period ends roughly around 536 BC. You could stretch that out to 516 BC because that's when the second temple is completed. But we'll just call it 536 for our purposes this evening. This is when the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great sends 50,000 Jewish refugees from Babylon, where he has taken over the rule. He sends them back to Jerusalem for the express purpose of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. All right, so that's just kind of a quick overview of some of the things that we looked at last week. I managed to squeeze 48 slides into 2 slides tonight. There was a lot more information, though, that we covered last week. All right, so I want to just remind us of the reason why these kingdoms split. And we looked at that not last week, but the week before in 1 Kings chapter 11. So the reason why is because Solomon, in his old age, grew unfaithful to God. God had given him all of these advantages. He had given him wisdom beyond measure. He had given him peace from his enemies, wealth. The nation was really at its high point. It was at its zenith. And Solomon squandered that by marrying way too many women. He had, 300 wives and 700 concubines. And unfortunately, a lot of his wives came from foreign countries. This was not unusual in the ancient world, because one way you could keep your enemy from attacking you is if you married the daughter of the king, right? That would give you safety and security from your enemies. And it seems like Solomon probably made a few hundred too many of those alliances, right? And his wives from these foreign lands eventually just were a bad influence, right? Because they kept worshiping their own gods and goddesses, and they had their effect on Solomon. And this, of course, is a good lesson for anyone who's thinking about getting married. You got to be careful who you marry. You got to be careful, because there's really two decisions in your life that are going to determine where you end up. Number one, am I going to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? And number two, who am I going to marry? The answers to those two questions are going to dictate the way our lives go. And when you make a good choice with marriage, things go well. And of course, in Solomon's case, he made some bad choices, and for that reason, his descendants didn't lose the kingdom, but they lost a big chunk of the kingdom, right? That was God's punishment for Solomon's infidelity. He let the descendants of David rule in Judah, but the other 10 tribes were given over to the rule of Jeroboam. Okay, so we've set the stage for tonight's lesson, chapter 12, and it's only one chapter this evening, so I went ahead and I put some slides together on the book of Ecclesiastes, because we've studied that on Wednesday nights, but it's been a few years since we went through it. And I thought maybe a little refresher might help, because it's the book that Solomon appears to have written late in his life after he has drifted away from God, and it's an appropriate book to study at this particular point. So we're getting into 1 Kings chapter 12, and we'll just read the first 4 verses to start with. And Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. So it happened, when Jeroboam the son of Nebat heard it, he was still in Egypt, for he had fled from the presence of King Solomon and had been dwelling in Egypt, that they sent and called him. Then Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. Now we got into this a little bit last week, but basically what the people are asking for is relief. The taxes are heavy, and before they acclaim Rehoboam to be their king, they'd like to know, are you going to keep the tax policy in place, or are you going to give us a tax cut? Now Rehoboam assembles the nation at Shechem. And Shechem is a location with a long history. We've talked a little bit about Shechem here and there, but I wanted to bring it up because it's got some symbolic meaning. Rehoboam chose this location for a specific reason. Now, not this first reason, but I bring this up because this kind of gives us a sense of the history of this place. So you might remember Dinah, who's one of the daughters of Leah. We think Leah may have had more than one, although Dinah is the only one mentioned by name. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, was raped by Shechem. This is where the name Shechem comes from. Simon and Levi killed all the males after they were circumcised. I don't know if you remember that story, but basically they raped Dinah, and then the folks at Shechem agree, well, all the males will get circumcised, and while they're in pain, Levi and Simeon come through and kill them all. It's a pretty horrific story, but that's where we're introduced to Shechem, and it bears the name of this man who did this thing to Dinah. But it's also the site of 2 very important mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And these are brought up in the Old Law. When the children of Israel invaded the land of Canaan, one of the things they were to do once matters had been settled was the whole congregation was to go to this region, to Shechem, and part of the tribes were to get on Mount Gerizim, and part of the tribes were to get on Mount Ebal, and we'll take a look at a map here, and you'll see they're pretty close to one another. And on Mount Gerizim, they would pronounce all the blessings that they would enjoy if they obeyed God. And those who were stationed on Mount Ebal would pronounce all of the curses that they would endure if they disobeyed God. So Mount Gerizim is the mountain of blessing. Mount Ebal is the mountain of cursing. And just incidentally, in John chapter 4, when Jesus visits the Samaritan woman, she says, on this mountain our fathers have worshipped. And she's talking about Mount Gerizim because that was the mountain that the Samaritans believed was the sacred mountain. Not the mountain, not Mount Moriah down in Jerusalem, but Mount Gerizim. That's where they built their temple. It was eventually destroyed. Anyway, so this is a very important location. It's also where Joshua gathers the entire congregation of Israel in Joshua chapter 4 to renew their covenant with God. So this may have happened, I shouldn't say that. He gathers the entire congregation and they renew the covenant in Joshua chapter 24. This is that passage where Joshua says, are you going to serve the gods of your fathers, or are you going to serve Jehovah? He says, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. That's that passage. But this happens at Shechem. And then finally, Gideon's son Abimelech in the book of Judges was made king by the Shechemites. So you've got some history here. Rehoboam chose this location, I think, for a very specific reason. It's got a long history with the Jewish people. There's some symbolism behind it. I think probably the two mountains, and particularly the mountain of blessing, probably came to mind. Anyway, so here's a map of the northern kingdom of Israel. It's in the green here. We looked at this map last week. And down here is Shechem. And just to kind of give you a little bit closer look at this region. So Shechem is right there. Okay, and you can see Mount Gerizim is right there, and Mount Ebal is right there. Okay, so I don't know. I'm guessing that they were close enough that the folks on Mount Gerizim could talk loud enough for the folks over on Mount Ebal to hear them, and then they could respond. But at least that's how I imagine it in my mind. But anyways, be that as it may. That seems to be why this region was selected, because of this long history, because Mount Gerizim was the mountain of blessing. So, just to kind of reset the stage here, Rehoboam has called all of Israel, all 12 tribes, to Shechem. And the northern kingdom, Israel. Remember, once we get to chapter 12, when you see Israel, think to yourself, we're talking about the northern 10 tribes. They come to Rehoboam, and they say, we're being taxed way too heavily. Will you lighten the load? And what's implied in this request is, we will not recognize you as king unless you cut our taxes. The only way they will acclaim Rehoboam as the successor to Solomon is if he gives them a break. But Rehoboam is not the kind of guy to do that sort of thing. Who is Rehoboam? We talked about this a little bit last week. Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines, as I mentioned a moment ago. And we know from 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 21, that Rehoboam, his mother was, I'm guessing this is pronounced Naamah. I'm going to go with that. Naamah, and she was an Ammonitess. She was from the nation of Ammon. And you might recall, in our lesson a couple of weeks ago, we spent a lot of time talking about the god Molech. Molech was one of the gods that the children of Israel sacrificed their children to. And it began in some high places, but eventually moved to the valley of the son of Hinnom. And that's the place that Jesus refers to in his teachings as Gehenna. That means valley of the son of, or valley of Hinnom, I should say. So that's the god Molech from the Ammonites. We also know from 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 23 and 24, that during the reign of Rehoboam, the high places and sacred groves proliferate all across Judah. So what Solomon began Rehoboam seems to increase in his reign. And there's also a comment made in chapter 14, verse 24, about perverted persons. And I'm going to keep tonight's class PG-13, but this is just one of those moments where I feel a bit of a duty just to kind of give us a sense of how reprobate the worship of foreign gods and goddesses were. So in a lot of these pagan religions, they would keep cult prostitutes. Prostitution was a big part of it. But not just female prostitutes, they would also keep male prostitutes as well. And that's what these perverted persons, quote unquote, refer to. This refers to both sodomy and prostitution as a part of pagan worship. So when we get over to books like 1 Corinthians, and Paul is hammering on things like sexual immorality and idolatry, that's the reason why. These two things go hand in hand. Basically, you put sexual immorality, idolatry, and drunkenness all together. I mean, there's kind of a package deal in the ancient world. And that's why Paul hammers those two issues so heavily with the Corinthians, because they're living in that city that's got a temple with 1,000 prostitutes in it. All right. So this is the flavor, if you will, of the reign of Rehoboam. He is not a good man. He is not a good king. And that seems to be from the influence of his mother, unfortunately. So his response to the people when they've asked for relief is, "Depart for 3 days, then come back to me." And the people departed. Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived. And he said, "How do you advise me to answer these people?" And they spoke to him, saying, "If you will be a servant to these people today and serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever." This was the statement that Darrell brought up last week. We spent just a little bit of time commenting on this, about comparing the wisdom of the older to the younger. And of course, both age demographics have their strengths. I think I'm kind of stuck in between the two of them, although I don't know, maybe I'm more on the older side now. I don't feel that way, but maybe I am. But, you know, both groups, as I kind of sit here straddling the fence right now, I can see real advantages to being both young and old. I can see both as being handy. Well, the elders' advice to Rehoboam falls on deaf ears. So he first consults Solomon's advisors, and you know, these were probably the men who were privy to all of Solomon's deliberations when he was thinking about how to tax the people. So they were probably on the inside. They may have even been a part of those conversations. They probably knew the thinking behind the tax policy, and their idea was, give the people what they want. This is an opportunity to curry favor with the people. If you're kind to them, they'll want to follow you. So it seems like a pretty smart political move. It also seems to hearken back, if you will, to something Solomon says in the book of Proverbs, chapter 15, verse 1. "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." That pretty much describes 1 Kings chapter 12, right? Here are the two paths that Rehoboam could have gone. He could have given them the soft answer, given them the tax break, won some favor with the people, and secured the throne. Instead, he decides to go the harsh path. And really what we have here is a comparison of smart politics versus raw power. Because what's the direction Rehoboam decides to go? I'm the king, and I'm going to do what I want to do, because that's the advice he gets from the younger men, right? Verses 8 through 11. But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. And he said to them, "What advice do you give? How should we answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, 'Lighten the yoke which your father put on us'?" Then the young man who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, "Thus you shall speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us.' Thus you shall say to them, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. I have no idea why Rehoboam thought this was a good idea. This just seems foolhardy to me. It just seems silly. But it reminded me of something Solomon says in the book of Ecclesiastes. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, this is not our study of Ecclesiastes just yet. We'll get to that maybe here in a little bit, depending on how fast I go. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 18, Solomon says, "Thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and great evil." Basically what Solomon is saying, I've worked hard, I have built up all this wealth, and I'm going to hand it off to someone who hasn't earned it, and who knows if he will do well with it or if he will do poorly. What a way, right? You do all this work, you have something to pass off to the next generation, and you just don't know what are they going to do with it. And in the case of Rehoboam, he ends up being the foolish son, right? Now, we go back to 1 Kings chapter 11, and we think, well, God said that this was going to happen. And I think God, in his foresight, knew. He knew what was going to happen before it took place. And that's the reason why I think he arranged things the way he did. I think in this instance, we see God's providence at work. That Rehoboam was the exact man God knew would be on the throne and would create this mess with his decision. So the prediction is fulfilled. Solomon had brought the kingdom to its greatest heights, but his policies were divisive. And I think that that's something that's worth bearing in mind. The seeds of this division go back to the reign of Solomon through some of the decisions he made. For all of his wisdom, he made mistakes. And those mistakes end up harming the nation in the end. The foolish son he feared has inherited the throne. So as the comment is made here in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 15, the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So Ahijah the Shilonite, memory serves me correct, was the prophet that God sent to Jeroboam to anoint him to be the king of Israel. Jeroboam had to go on the run. He ends up taking sanctuary in Egypt because Solomon wants him dead. He comes back after Solomon's death because he's safe. All right, I'm going to pause here. Any questions or comments so far? We good? Good to keep moving? All right. I'm just going to sum up verses 16 through 24. I don't know that I need to read any of that. Basically, what happens in those 9 verses, Israel rejects Rehoboam and the house of David. So they went to Rehoboam asking him to lighten their tax burden. If he did, I think they would have acclaimed him king. But because he says no, they reject Rehoboam, they reject the house of David. When a tax collector is sent to take in the taxes, they stone him to death. And they acclaim Jeroboam as the king of Israel. Rehoboam decides, well, I'm just going to take them back by force. But there's this really interesting moment in verses 22 through 24. God dispatches a prophet, Shemaiah, to talk to Rehoboam. And he says, don't do this. Do not do this. And it's really interesting
Rehoboam ignored his advisors earlier in the chapter, but he listens to the prophets, which I thought about that today, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. Why did he listen to the prophet here and not to his advisors earlier? Probably because he could see the folly of his decisions earlier. But for whatever reason, Rehoboam actually does listen to the prophets and does not attack the northern kingdom of Israel. So civil war is stopped. All right, so we continue on in verse 25. I touched on this just a little bit last week, but this is a really important moment because there's a lot of layers here. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the mountains of Ephraim, and dwelt there. Also he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. All right, so Jeroboam built his first capital up there at Shechem. And he decides that he needs to be very careful how he proceeds. Now, there's something that's important that's established very early on in the Jewish nation. And that's a separation, if you will, between the religious and civil authority. So in Exodus chapter 28, verse number 1, God separates Aaron and his sons to be his priests. Moses, though, remains the civil authority, right? People come to Moses when they need to sort their problems out. Moses has his deputies that hear the smaller matters, and then he hears the matters that need to that cannot be settled by the lower jurisdictions. Moses remains the civil authority, but Aaron is made the religious authority. So there's this separation, if you will, these 2 different spheres of authority that are established fairly early on in the Jewish nation's existence. And this continues on. There's the tribe of Levi, which is the tribe that's concerned with all things religious, right? And who's the ruling tribe that God eventually lands on? He wants the tribe of Judah to be the ruling tribe, right? So you have a separation between the ruling authority and the religious authority by tribe as well. And there's one king that tried to take some measure of religious authority into his own hands. We actually talked about this a few months ago when we looked at the story of Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 15 when he disobeys God. He spares King Agag of the Amalekites and keeps the best of the goods that they won in war. And Samuel very famously says to Saul that obedience is better than sacrifice. And we looked at several lessons from the Old Testament that teach us about the importance of worship and worshiping God in the right way, like Cain and Abel, and Nadab and Abihu, and the example, of course, of Saul. And then this example of King Uzziah. King Uzziah was one of the sort of good kings of Judah, and he brings Judah again to a very high place, very powerful place. But he gets a little too big for his britches. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verses 16 through 21, King Uzziah goes into the temple and he attempts to offer incense on the altar of incense. Now, the only people who could go inside of the holy place were the priests. The only ones who could change out the incense on the altar of incense were the priests. But the king decided, I can go do that. And he begins to blend this separation that God had made very clear from the outset, that these 2 spheres of authority were not to overlap. Well, that is not the case among the pagans. Pagan nations had very different practices. They commonly blended kingly authority with religious authority. Let me give you a few examples from history. We took a look at this clear back when, probably approaching a year ago, when we looked at the story of the children of Israel in Egypt. The Egyptians considered Pharaoh to be a god. The Babylonians, the great king Hammurabi, claimed that he received his law from the god Marduk. So why were people to follow the law of Hammurabi? Because he had received it from Marduk, right? So that blending of civil and religious authority. Then you also have in Sumer, the kings were seen as intermediaries between the divine and human. So you have this blending together among the pagan nations, and that's essentially what Jeroboam does up in the northern kingdom of Israel. He's very smart about this. He fashions these golden calves like the children of Israel worshipped at the foot of Mount Sinai, back in Exodus chapter 32, verses 4 and 8. And he says to the people, these are the gods that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And this is really smart, because what Jeroboam is doing is he's tapping in to Jewish history in order to create his own mythology, if you will. And these sorts of things are done all the time. I mean, in our country, we have our own myths that we pass around, right? Like, was it George Washington who chopped down the cherry tree? Am I remembering that? I kind of have to remember that story, right? That probably didn't happen. That's a myth. That's part of the American mythos. Those stories that sort of surround our founding, about our founders, that bring a country together. He also establishes a liturgical calendar, and what's really interesting is he chooses the 8th month and the 15th day as a day when the whole congregation would gather together and offer sacrifices. Here's why that's significant. That's 1 month after the Feast of the Tabernacles. Now, what did the Feast of Tabernacles commemorate beginning on the 7th month, the 15th day of the 7th month? Well, the Feast of Tabernacles commemorated the children of Israel wandering through the wilderness for 40 years, living in what? Living in tents. All right, so he's got 2 golden calves. These are the gods which brought you out of Egypt. He institutes a national holiday that mimics the holiday that commemorates the wandering through the wilderness. What's he doing? Well, he's creating a national cohesion. He's creating a shared identity. He's coming up with stories that unite people and holidays that they worship together. This is exactly what you do when you break away and you begin forming your own nation. What did we do when we broke away from the British? We did the exact same sorts of things, right? We came up with our own holidays. We came up with our stories that we tell ourselves about our founding. This is what you do. And when you throw the religious element in, that makes it even more powerful. So he sets up pagan houses of worship, shrines, in Dan, which is in the very far north, and Bethel, which is in the very far south. So the 2 extremes, north and south, in the nation. And then he leads the nation in worshiping these false gods. Jeroboam is really smart. He knows exactly what he needs to do to unite this nation together and to establish it as a separate entity from Judah. And of course, his big concern is, if we don't do something to keep people from going back to Jerusalem, we're going to lose people, right? Because people won't stay up here. They're going to go back to Jerusalem, and then they might just choose to stay down there. And our nation will progressively become weaker and weaker. Let's take a look at a map here just to kind of give you a sense. So, again, I mentioned a moment ago, Dan is clear up here in the north, okay? And Bethel is clear down here in the south. So, see, you've got the very north extreme and the very southern extreme. So wherever you are in Israel, you can make your way very easily to a house of worship. it's a religion of convenience, isn't it? You don't have to go all the way to Jerusalem. Just go to Bethel. Just go to Dan. It's a lot closer. You don't have to go all the way down there. All right. Why Bethel and why Dan? Well, Bethel, back in Genesis chapter 28, verses 16 through 19, is a very special place. Again, notice the locations that are being chosen, right? These aren't arbitrary selections. Bethel was chosen because of, I believe, because of this story. This is when Jacob has the dream of the ladder stretching from earth to heaven. It was probably a stairway. Angels going up and down that stairway. Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." And Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put in his head, set it up as a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of that city had been Luz previously. So why did Jeroboam choose Bethel? Because of this history. It was already a sacred site. Again, this is something that happened in the ancient world. So let's take the city of Ephesus as an example. So the city of Ephesus had a temple in it that stretches back into the 800s BC. When the Greeks conquer it, the temple that was dedicated to what they call the Lady of Ephesus, the Greeks were like, "Oh, well, that's the goddess Diana. That's who we worship." And so they adopt that sacred location and say, "Well, that's just the goddess Diana that you've been worshiping all along." See, these are the sorts of things that shrewd, powerful men do in order to get their way. Bethel was chosen because it was an ancient sacred site. And Dan was chosen for similar reasons. Now, we're going really far back in the archives now. This is a story that we looked at clear back in September of, it'd be 2023. September, October, somewhere in that neighborhood. Dan had a similar reason why. In Judges chapter 18, verses 29 through 31, the tribe of Dan conquers this territory up in the northern part of Israel. And they called the name of that city Dan, after the name of Dan their father, who was born to Israel. However, the name of the city was formerly Laish. Then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. All right, we're getting just bits and pieces of the end of this story, but I want to just do a little refresher course. So remember, back in Judges chapter 17, you got this guy by the name of Micah. That's not the prophet Micah. He lives hundreds of years later. This guy Micah has an idol made. He decides, "I'm going to build a shrine here in my house to this idol." And then he hires a Levite to be his priest. Is this story kind of ringing a bell a little bit? Okay. Well, along comes the tribe of Dan, and they decide, we kind of like that idol, so we're going to take it. So they took the idol, and they're on the hunt for new territory. They take the idol from Micah, and that's the shrine that is being referred to up in Dan. The city of Dan essentially becomes a rival to the tabernacle in Shiloh. They've got their own priests up in Dan. The priests are taken from the tribe of Manasseh, not from Levi, but from Manasseh. They've got an idol, they've got a shrine. Dan becomes a rival to God's house in Shiloh. And the tribe of Dan is the first tribe to collectively leave Jehovah. So they leave Jehovah behind. So these two locations were chosen not just because of their geographical proximity, not because they were easy to get to, but because they were understood to be sacred sites. They've been sacred sites for hundreds and hundreds of years. Is it really 650? Is that possible? Well, that would fast for me. I can't say anything for you all. You're all like, oh, is it 7 o'clock yet? All right. Basically, what I'm driving toward with all of this is if you control the religion, you control the people. Period. That's as old as the Bible itself. But I want to end on this note. We probably won't take much time to get into Ecclesiastes because I've read myself out of time. But not everyone up in the north is on board with this. And this is one of those occasions where I'm really glad we have the book of 2 Chronicles. Because 2 Chronicles tells us a lot of the same stories about the nation of Judah. But sometimes Ezra includes some details that we don't get from Jeremiah in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. In 2 Chronicles chapter 11, beginning in verse 13, and from all their territories the priests and the Levites who were in all Israel took their stand with him. For the Levites left their common lands and their possessions and came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them from serving as priests to the Lord. Then he appointed for himself priests for the high places, for the demons and the calf idols which he had made. And after the Levites left, those from all the tribes of Israel, such as set their heart to seek the Lord their God, came to Jerusalem to sacrifice to the Lord God of their fathers. So they strengthened the kingdom of Judah and made Rehoboam the son of Solomon strong for 3 years, because they walked in the way of David and Solomon for 3 years. So even though Jeroboam by and large took those 10 tribes with him, there were a few conscientious objectors among them, principally among the Levites. Remember, the Levites had cities and territories sprinkled all throughout the 12 tribes' inheritance. So all the Levites who had hereditary lands up in the north, they left and they went down south because Jeroboam did not want to use them as priests. So they end up going down north, and then you've also got some conscientious objectors among the other tribes in the north who they want to worship Jehovah. They are not on board with these gods that Jeroboam is setting up, these alternate shrines, these alternate houses of worship. So they go back down to Judah and end up down there living as refugees. So we're kind of painting with some broad brushstrokes when we say the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. In reality, we've got a fair amount of mixing going on in the South in particular. So I'll close. Any questions or comments? I can talk about Ecclesiastes for 5 minutes if you want it. Okay, I'm getting some head nods, yes. Sorry, I just got a text message. I wanted to be sure somebody wasn't trying to message us here. Let me get just a little bit of Ecclesiastes. Somebody else messaged me. It looked like maybe on the... Oh, somebody's watching from Kenya. Glad you're tuning in.
Wow.
All right, how about that? Yeah, very good. Let's do just a little bit of Ecclesiastes here, folks. So the book begins, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One of the important things to remember in the book of Ecclesiastes is when Solomon talks about under the sun, what he means is life here on earth without God in the equation. All right? The author uses this phrase 28 times in Ecclesiastes, and basically under the sun just means material life. Life without God, life without spirituality. So you could say Ecclesiastes is like going the opposite direction of Deuteronomy. There's this emphasis in Deuteronomy. Love the Lord your God, keep his commandments, do not deviate, do not turn to the right hand or to the left. Walk the path that God has set before you. That message is hammered home again and again in the book of Deuteronomy. Keep God's commandments, do not deviate. Ecclesiastes is the book that asks, well, what happens when we deviate? Like, is keeping God's commands really all that worthwhile? What happens if you just live life to the fullest without God in the equation, so to speak? So when you go through the book of Ecclesiastes, when you read it, just be very careful. It's an exploration of what life is like under the sun. And it is a pre-Christian view of the world. And that's something that's terribly important to bear in mind. That this is Solomon looking at life without the benefit of everything we know from Matthew to Revelation. And that's important to remember. That this was a book written in a time period where Solomon knew less about spirituality than we know. Period. Even though he was the wisest man, he still didn't know all the things that we know about heaven, for example. And that's just one example among many. Where Ecclesiastes really helps is it's a book that is great to study with someone who is skeptical about faith, or maybe even an atheist. Because it very much is sketching out an atheistic worldview. Like, what is life like when you don't have God? And the conclusions that Solomon reaches, I think, can be quite helpful for someone who has their doubts. So basically, Ecclesiastes is Solomon recording, I'm going to put everything in the world to the test, and we'll just see what we find. And I think this book was likely written at the end of his days. You get to chapter 12, and he talks about what it's like to be an old person. And I've never been an old person, so reading that description kind of helps me understand what it's like to live in a body that's just progressively breaking down. And it seems like the kind of thing that only a person who's experiencing that could write. Chapter 2 is really interesting because basically he says, I'm going to live life up and see what happens. So he builds houses, he plants orchards, he has parties, he eats, he drinks, and makes merry. And he reaches a conclusion. I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Now that sounds like Solomon, right? You read the descriptions of what Jerusalem was like in the days of the heights of Solomon, and there's nobody who had Jerusalem in a better place than Solomon. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon uses the Hebrew word havel, and that's generally translated vanity. The word literally means air or breath, something that is fleeting, something that is without substance, something that is unreliable. It describes actions and work that do not last or appear to lead to no lasting goal. They can't be explained in any rational or human way. Basically, it's like grasping for the wind, right? You can't get your arms around it. So living life under the sun, living life without purpose, living life in the pure pursuit of pleasure, living like an Epicurean, just leads to a sense of meaninglessness. It is like trying to grasp for the wind. So that's just a quick, there's other things that I could say. I've got 12 more slides, but I'm out of time, and we're just going to have to close it there. But I find Ecclesiastes to be a very valuable book. I remember one of my elders took a group of guys and myself through that book while we were in college. And I found that study to be incredibly useful because a lot of the worldviews that I was being exposed to in college, Solomon was talking about them in this book. It was a very valuable book at that time in my life. And I encourage you to give it a read. And just remember, life under the sun does not mean life with God. And it sets out to accomplish a very different objective. All right, let's close there, and we'll take a moment to extend the gospel invitation. And Customarily, I would stand up here and sing, but you'll have to excuse me this evening. I'm going to go back and turn our stream off so that we have our announcements aren't online. But if there's anyone here who needs to be restored back to the church, needs the prayers of the church, or if you're listening online and you're looking for Jesus Christ, you're looking for the truth, you're looking for the right way, drop us a message. Leave us a comment. Tell us how we can reach out and help you. Wherever you are, whatever you need, we're here to help. Let's stand and sing.
577. Walking in sunlight on my journey over the mountain